Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer here with Grace Francis for episode 3 of season 11 of the Social Change Career Podcast. We're going to be talking today about careers in combating gender-based violence and advancing equity. Not very happy topics, but super critical and important. For people who have not joined us before, this is a live stream. So while this is going on, please at any time let us know where you're watching from. You can use the comments. Primarily LinkedIn is the best place to engage. And then also, we'd love to bring in questions and comments from the audience. So feel free to add a comment, a question, share a quick story. I mean, obviously, this is being recorded and live, so only things that you feel comfortable sharing. A little bit about Grace. I'll summarize her bio. She is the Director of Community Partnerships for End Violence Against Women International, also known as EVW. You can tell me if I'm getting that correct, and leads the collaborative partnership that created the new sexual assault medical forensic exam virtual practicum. She also focuses on fundraising to expand their work and improve criminal justice and community responses to sexual assault survivors or for sexual assault survivors. She worked for the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence for 16 years, where she initiated and ran the state's first trauma-informed sexual assault investigations program for law enforcement, emergency dispatchers, and prosecutors. She also managed statewide certification of Florida's 31 sexual assault programs, working with centers to ensure quality service provision and build in much more equity. She also spent 5 years as a volunteer advocate supporting sexual assault victims and 11 years as a volunteer counselor for a crisis hotline. Hopefully you can let us know which one. She holds a bachelor's from the University of Oregon and holds a master's in public administration from UNC Chapel Hill. Outside of her work, previously she's also done a lot of environmental work, policy work, electoral work, legislative work, and she is a very strong advocate for community-based schools and public schooling and equity in general. Just two other things before we jump in, and I'll welcome everyone. Again, throughout this session, please let us know where you're watching from, maybe share a sentence or two about your background. And the two things that we would ask, we do this, Grace, we're both committed to social impact. So please check out Ending Violence Against Women International, follow Grace on LinkedIn, check out PCDN and the podcast. We're up to about 115 episodes with changemakers from all over the world doing honest career conversations about the good and the bad and challenges of advancing impact. So please consider sharing and even better rating the podcast just to help grow our reach. So that's about it now. So let me just welcome a few people before we jump in. Let me just get it here. Okay, welcome Sabira. Let us know where you're watching from. We got someone from California. Welcome Michaela from Tallahassee, but works nationally. Maybe you know each other. Welcome Doris from Kenya. Welcome Tuluwalape from Nigeria. Doris is working on sexual and reproductive human rights and gender-based violence. So again, as we're going throughout this, please let us know where you're watching from. And Grace, thank you. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. So Grace, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I think we see your dog in the background, Cricket. So can you talk a little bit about, you've had a high impact career working on very challenging issues. And so just a little bit about the thread that, from early, let's say, activism to what you're doing now. What are the threads that draw your work together?
Thank you, Craig. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm a big fan of this podcast. It's an honor to be a guest. So I always knew I wanted to go into a career in social impact. My dad was a union leader in Alaska. I grew up in Alaska. My mom was very, active in pro-choice issues. I went to the University of Oregon, which is a very activist campus. And I also care a lot about international issues. When I was 17, I lived in Argentina for a year as a high school exchange student, which really opened my eyes to what people are facing around the world and the kind of social justice that we're all fighting for. But then when I was in college, I started volunteering at the local rape crisis center my first year in college, and I've been doing it ever since. I've been in the social impact sector ever since that. So after college, I realized that to make a bigger impact, I needed the skills to organize and advance policy. So I became an organizer with the public interest research groups. They have since branched out and They are environment, Florida, for instance, and the PERGs. But that was the best training ground for my entire career. I learned how to run campaigns, organize people, advance policy, form coalitions, plan events. So I did that for about a year and a half. And I also learned how to fundraise right out of college. I was a Canvas director for a summer, raising money for the Sierra Club and other environmental issues. And so that has always served me. And just the idea that in order to do this work, you have to raise the money. And that those two things go hand in hand. And giving people an opportunity to participate either by writing letters, going to rallies, or writing a check, those are all important things.
Wonderful. So I do have to say, two of my worst jobs ever. One is we should have an episode about worst jobs ever. Actually, I'm going to ask you that. So my worst job ever was probably digging holes on a Christmas tree farm. That was just like a week. And then I was a canvasser for Greenpeace in the college between semesters. And I can do fundraising, but I had a really hard time.
Right.
I didn't mind the door-to-door advocacy, but asking people for money, both thinking, I think Greenpeace does great work, but in my mind, I'm thinking you're going to be giving a check, which I was horrible at doing that kind of fundraising. But then also like, I'm going to take 30 or 40 or 50% for me. It just felt awkward. So I think that was I was a horrible canvasser. So actually, so before we jump in, what if you're open to sharing, you don't have to name the organization, but what's been your worst job ever? Not in terms of bad management, but just like what you do.
I've got to say that was my best job and my worst job all at the same time. Okay. We were literally working 90 hours a week. The only hours we were not working is when we were traveling home and then sleeping. And so, but it was, I learned so much that summer. You learn to get over what you're uncomfortable with. You're knocking on doors, talking to strangers about politics and asking them for money. And that actually was the easy part. It also entailed recruiting canvassers, training them, budgeting, payroll, all of those things. So I learned so much. And it was also a really hard summer. So I am really grateful for the experience, though.
So thinking about education, so you did the bachelor's. I did my bachelor's at University of Massachusetts, and we spent a lot of time protesting and taking over buildings. It's been called the Berkeley of the East. So I'm curious, like you did undergrad, and I forgot if the study abroad in Argentina, I think, was pre-university. Was that high school?
It was. Yeah. It was, which led me to major in Spanish and international studies in college.
Okay. So two things. One, just talk about doing that study abroad experience at a young age, how that impacted you. And then two, at what age, how many years after undergraduate did you choose to do a master's in public administration? And for people who are thinking about if they need a graduate degree or not, your general advice both about sector, how to pick a program, and why you choose public administration.
Okay, yep. So in high school, I spent a year in Argentina living with families, going to school every day with my host brothers and sisters. And so that was, I was just entrenched in the culture and really thought, wow, I am realizing things that I never would have even thought of, and how people live and what people struggle with and how we are all connected in a way that, if I had just continued going to high school in Alaska, I wouldn't have. And so that influenced what I wanted to do in my career. And I have done some international work, which I'm really proud of and been really privileged to do. And so then after college, and being an organizer, I worked for the Florida legislature. I did some more, I worked for the House Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, which was extremely useful in learning how the political process works. So you can learn it in school, and that is really useful to know how government works. But then when you see it in action, you learn so much of what you think is true, and then you really learn that it is true, and how policy really is influenced and what it takes to make a difference. And I learned a lot more about how to be effective in that area. And then I started working at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. I was there for probably 14 years before I decided to go back to grad school. And I was feeling a bit stuck in my career. I was trying to decide what I wanted to do next. I really felt passionate about what I was doing, but I wanted to take it to the next level. And so I decided to get a master's of public administration because that's a degree that's useful in so many areas. It's kind of like an MBA for the public sector and for nonprofits. So I learned budgeting, HR, research. It improved my writing, and so for me, it was really useful. It was also difficult, when you're working full time and you've got kids, and you're going to school. It's a lot, but it has definitely been useful to me.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. So again, I'll welcome a few more people. So welcome Ruth from Kenya, Isabel, long time no talk, from Bogota, Lena from Michigan, Halma from Tanzania. We have someone from UN Women, someone from Benin Republic. So please start sharing your questions and comments. So two questions. So in your current work, what skills, when people think, because you're mid-career at a pretty high level, and you think back to early career, like what skills have you found most valuable? So we've talked about organizing and canvassing and learning how to budget and to raise money. So at your early stage of your career, because you worked in different areas, like what skills did you find most valuable across those areas? And as you've kind of grown in your career and impact, are there any other skills that you've realized? Is it just getting deeper and better at the skills, or there's more new skills you need to develop?
Oh, wow. So our workplace, work environment globally is changing all the time. There are always new skills to learn. When I started in this field, there was no social media. we didn't have to be good at that. We had, different ways. There was not even caller ID when I was organizing students. And so everybody always picked up the phone. That was easy. And so I would say the skills that really served me early on were being able to write and being able to build relationships, partnerships, because in social impact work, this is certainly true in the field of fighting gender-based violence. If you are working with survivors who are getting terrible treatment at the local hospital when they go in for a medical forensic exam, you can't do that on your own. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to go to the hospital and ask them to do a better job. You need to build coalitions. You need to work with law enforcement and talk with them about how the evidence that they're getting is not going to help them investigate this case. It's not going to help them prosecute. It's not going to keep our community safer. It's not going to do justice by survivors. So you bring in law enforcement, you bring in advocacy organizations. You talk with the hospital, you talk with prosecutors, local government. What is the message that is going to resonate with them? And then how do you build a coalition to share that message and to make that difference? And that's the same in organizing for sexual violence. It's the same in improving our public education and increasing equity in public schools. It's the same in fundraising. So I would say those are the skills that have definitely served me well, in addition to learning how to budget and learning all of the other tricks of nonprofit work along the way.
Okay. So my wife Catalina, who many of you know or have seen, we work together at PCDN, has been doing work on gender and peace and conflict and economics for many years, and policy. And so when people think about, let's say someone's at the early stage of their career and they know they want to work on something working on gender, so whether it's reducing violence, like how do you encourage people, let's say, who just know they want to help address equity? How do they find the right space within gender, both in terms of skills, but where the jobs are? So how do you encourage people to figure out, because there's so many areas of need and opportunity. So for people who this might be one of the central issues, how do you encourage people to find the right niche?
The thing about gender-based violence is it pervades every part of our society, and it impacts people at every level. And so and there are so many people who are leading this movement who are survivors themselves, and so they have that own lived expertise in what survivors need from systems and from families and friends, and that there is actually fighting gender-based violence. There are positions in so many sectors. In the private sector, Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, they all have gender-based violence. Or people working in gender-based violence to make sure that they keep their companies as safe as possible. From the very, if you are just starting your career, I would say the best thing you can do is get involved locally and find your local rape crisis center or your domestic violence program, human trafficking. If you care about reproductive rights, go to your local Planned Parenthood or local reproductive rights center, go to their events. Go through their training. That's what I did really early on. And that opened my eyes. It gave me a lot of skills that I have used ever since in every sector, whether it's just being a better listener. That has been extremely useful. And then you can go from there, because that gives you more issue expertise. I mean, if I hadn't volunteered at our rape crisis center in Eugene in college, I wouldn't have gotten the job at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence.
Yeah, my brother worked for many years. Now he's a social entrepreneur, but worked many years with men who were either perpetrators or potential perpetrators of domestic violence, but in partnership with women's groups. So, I mean, there's so many, and Catalina didn't work on so much violence prevention, but more economic development and policy changes. So there's so many. So one kind of just, it might be a dumb question, but if people are watching whatever police show is hot these days, what are, I mean, you have a pretty powerful set of experience, both building stakeholder coalitions and working with survivors. And so what are some of the myths around gender-based violence or rape that, maybe some of these police shows perpetrate? And what are some of the things that, if you could go, I mean, you're doing this in reality, but if you can go to policymakers or media people or others and just say, like, please stop showing this, and like, this is more realistic, or this is the challenges, or these are the things working, like what would you want if you had if you had like a weekly show, which, maybe Ending Violence Women's International does this, but like a weekly show saying, here's a myth and here's the challenge and the opportunity. What are some things that you see commonly repeated on, like, because people are addicted to crime shows?
Sure. And I would say two myths that are still common today, that I would like to debunk. And the truth is that most sexual assault is perpetrated by people the survivor knows and trusts. And so it's somebody you thought that you could trust who then betrays your trust, whether it's a family member or a coworker or, a friend in college, somebody you're at a party with. And that people don't make it up. People are not lying when they say that they have been that they have survived sexual violence. And so I would say believe survivors, because we know the research shows at least 92 to 98% of the time it is true, and also that it's perpetrated by somebody that probably the community also trusts.
And then a couple of questions are coming in, but two more questions on this. So one is, what is some of the data around the prevalence of sexual assault or gender-based violence? And is the prevalence of the percentage, how many people it affects, is it fairly universal? I mean, I know it can affect any class, any society, anybody, but is it, is it higher in some countries where patriarchy is even stronger, or like basically it's just everywhere equivalent and just some places it's worse?
First of all, I am not an expert on prevalence, but I will say in the United States, research shows that approximately 1 in 5 women in college will be sexually assaulted while they're in college. And then nationally, it's about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women. And then also people of all genders can be victimized by sexual assault. Large numbers of men also are victimized. Internationally, I don't have those numbers, but I know that End Violence Against Women International, and I also want to clarify that when today I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of my organization, but we work with people in Ghana, Uganda, other parts of the world where it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem in many communities. And we get to work with the people who are on the ground, helping survivors, making inroads in service provision in their governments. And I would say go to End Violence Against Women International, our website, or RAIN.org. They also are a great place to find information on statistics.
Okay. So last question before we get to some others that coming from people listening around the world.
Sure.
What do you think are, I mean, there's helping people who've been affected. There's also trying to develop policies to mitigate or prevent. So what, and because you have a pretty broad view from all different perspectives. So what do you see as some of the best ways to prevent this? Is it cultural change, policy change, laws? And what are some of the most inspiring things you see around when it does happen, like how to respond as systems or help survivors, like, because so many people are caught up in dysfunctional systems. So what's working well?
Yeah, so that's interesting. And so the field of sexual violence, it is just, and gender-based violence. My area has primarily been sexual violence, but there's prevention, and that is, when I started, prevention was basically learn how, take self-defense courses, and learn how to fight off your attacker. Those are important things. Increasing your personal safety is important, but the field has really recognized victims are not responsible for sexual assault or domestic violence. It's the perpetrator. And so it takes cultural change. There are so many organizations working on bystander interventions, on changing attitudes. Intersectionality is so important in recognizing that survivors and people experience so many things: sexual assault, domestic violence, racism, homophobia, and all of those things are interconnected. Did I answer the rest of that question? What was the rest of that?
The rest is kind of like, what are some of the things around prevention or response that you think are working well, or the most promising developments, or, because obviously it's context specific for funding and location and population, but like, what are some of the things you're like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting and it's showing promise, or others are adopting it?
Okay, that's great. I would say a lot of the bystander intervention programs, either whether it's with the military or college campuses or other big institutions, those are really interesting, and not just putting it on the victim or on the perpetrator, but engaging all of us as communities in preventing violence, interpersonal violence. And also another big thing that's working that I see is we have a Start by Believing campaign at End Violence Against Women International, and there are more than 700 communities around the world who adopt this campaign. It's law enforcement agencies, it's healthcare agencies, it's advocacy organizations, communicating that sexual assault and domestic violence will not be tolerated. And if you tell us that it happened to you, we will believe you, and we will get you the help that you need, whether it's from law enforcement, medical, whatever healing work that is needed. There's so many communities doing really impressive work. And so much of it is just building coalitions. So much of it is also recognizing that culturally specific interventions are what people need. So survivors who come from tribal communities are going to need, or may very well need, different healing interventions than, a white middle-class woman in Tallahassee.
Thank you so much. So just one quick comment. If anybody lost the stream for 1 second, I noticed one person that happened, just refresh the screen. It should work. So I'm going to start bringing questions. Krishna from Nepal is asking, how can equity-based programming be aligned with combating gender-based violence? And it's a pretty broad question, but any thoughts from your work in the US or overseas?
I would say that equity and combating gender-based violence go hand in hand, because when you are improving equity in communities, you're fighting economic inequities, you're fighting racial inequities, and sexual assault, gender-based violence, sexism, those are also inequities. And so building more just societies does also affect gender-based violence.
Okay, thanks so much. So Isabel is a longtime friend from Bogota. She does a lot of work with political candidates. So she's asking, why do you think the increase of women in elected office is not having such a big impact on policies and programs to prevent and punish violence against women? And I think she's talking particularly about we have like elections coming up in 2 months, more local and departmental elections. So do you have any response to that in general, or how can people both in office and running for office better advocate for changes, or any things around that aspect?
That is a great question. Our work nationally and in Florida is supported by women legislators and male legislators. So I would say that it is not necessarily just women who care about sexual assault, domestic violence, gender-based violence, or men. And what you have to do is overcome seriously entrenched systems and societal myths to make a difference in this area. And so it really does take hardcore organizing, regardless of who the politician is who's in office.
Okay. So a question related to this is, one of the things that in peace building, a lot of sexual assault violence and gender-based violence, it happens for lots of reasons, but part of it is can be huge power imbalances, and that people who have power, if you think about Russell Brand or all the Hollywood, some of often there's a power imbalance. And when people try to change power imbalances, often there could be a backlash. So I know I won't go into super context, but I have a friend who's one of the world's experts in a particular sector and helped organize a community against something. And the people who had more power were threatened, and there was violence committed. So when you're thinking about kind of trying to change or influence complex cultural or structural, let's say, beliefs, even if they're wrong, how do you organize for change, but also in the US, there's this whole battle over wokeness. So how do you try to organize for change and also minimize the degree of the backlash or the harm that could come to people pushing for change that's needed? It's not just, this is a question for all types of social changes, not just specific to this.
Oh, that's so true. When President Trump was in office, there was a mandate that the federal government would not fund any more training related to gender bias. Federal employees did not have to go to any training that made them feel bad about gender bias, which includes domestic violence, sexual assault, all gender-based violence. But at the same time, most people are against gender-based violence, regardless of their background. And nobody wants their child or anybody that they care about to be victimized. And so in Florida, we are a very Republican state. And so it really takes finding that common ground and alignment to say, here are the issues. We all care about survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence. Here's what we need. How can we make a difference? And so that's what we've seen. Also, the people who are on the ground, doing the more radical work, the really, making this an issue that people can't look away from, that is equally important.
Okay. So again, if you're watching, please let us know where you're watching from. Thanks for joining us from around the world. And please feel free to put in your questions and comments. And just a few more people. Welcome Sade, I think from Ethiopia. Welcome Joseph from Pro Passion Projects in Ghana. And so a question. So these are really, really hard issues, and a
They
lot
are.
of a lot of social change and impact work. It's a long, hard slog. And there's like successes. You meet the most incredible people in the world. There's setbacks. There's frustrations. So you've been working on these issues and challenges for a while. So what are your recommendations? Like, how do you take care of yourself and for others? I mean, all issues, whether it's climate change or poverty or inequality, like they're so complex. How do you, what's your advice to others who are working on, we're not planting community gardens, which is really important, but these are like, how do people sustain their work and not burn out? So whether it's working on sexual violence or any super challenge, war, like what is your advice for people, because no one person can save the world. So how do you balance this?
That is a hard balance. And it is very much recognizing that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and that every person plays a role in it, and that you are playing an important role in it, but it's not all on your shoulders. No one person can just snap their fingers and make a change. But also, if we stop the work, then we're not going to continue making forward motion. And I would just say, really get connected to the rest of the things in your life that you care about. If you care about ending gender-based violence and organic gardening, get out into your garden and make sure that you take time for yourself to connect with the things that really replenish you. Spend time with your family. All of those things. I would say that I have a good work-life balance. I have kids, I have friends, I have hobbies, and I really immerse myself in those things when I'm not working on these issues. And I feel re-energized to continue working, because this is what I care deeply about, is creating a more just society in so many ways.
Thank you so much. My friend Flynn Coleman, she's been on our podcast and lots of events, and wrote a great book on AI called A Human Algorithm. So she used a phrase which I love, because it was a similar type question. She works on war crimes and she said, like, basically hope is her resistance, like to not, like there's no choice, like, and she fundamentally, and she's not the one leading the work, she's supporting, but fundamentally believes like this just has to happen because it's the right thing to do, and the change or may not happen in any one person's lifetime, or the major level change, but just like it's hope, like just by doing resistance or acting or policy change, but it's a hard, complex thing. So for people who are thinking about working on these issues, whether it's sexual, some call it issues, challenges, and societal deficits. So someone who wants to work on preventing or responding to sexual violence, any advice how to pick an organization, or like what to look for so that the organization is not going to just put someone into a job and they're going to burn out, so basically, how do you find an organization where you're not just a cog in the wheel? Like the work might be important, but they're not treating the employees well. So is it like, should they have regular training beyond just like something online? Should there be a counselor available? Should they send you to conferences? Or like what, because these are challenging issues. So what are some of the most promising practices you see that you'd say to people, hey, if you have a potential job offer, like maybe think about these things?
Absolutely. In my work in Florida, I worked with 31 sexual assault programs that we certified, and that meant that they were meeting standards for victim services, for governance, that they were running strong programs. But even within those, there are ones that have more resources than others and have stronger leaders than others. And I would say it's really important to ask about what kind of training you're going to get, what kind of backup support you're going to get, how often you're going to be on call, if you're doing the front lines of hospital response or answering the hotline. Ask what kind of ongoing professional education you're going to get. Look at the turnover rate. Ask how long people in the organization have been in their positions. Ask what they think about work-life balance and how they handle things like, if you have to pick up your child who is sick from school, what's that going to be like? or if you need to stop and go home to visit your family to care for an ailing relative or something, just find out how human friendly the organization is, because there are so many amazing organizations doing good work, but the culture just from one town to another can be completely different in the organization.
Yes, and then obviously when organizations are funding, funding is not strong, that's not an excuse, but if there's not somewhat stable funding, it makes it much harder to support people in the way that they should be.
Yes.
If you think about kind of the trends in where policy and practice is going around gender-based violence, are there any emerging tools, techniques, trends, or skill areas? I mean, are people playing around with AI? I mean, it could be dangerous, but kind of saying I mean, I just watched an interesting TED Talk this morning on a positive aspect of AI, of using it to really calculate how to do wind power for large data set. They just said using AI for this data set actually led to a 20% reduction in costs. So is there any interesting experimentation going on around policy or technology, or it's really just human effort and organizing, advocating, or where do you see this field going in the next 5 or 10 years?
That's a great question. And I know that safety within AI spaces and within virtual reality is something that we're looking at that we haven't had to deal with before. People who are in games in virtual reality who are being assaulted or hurt in those games, and what is that like, and what are the jurisdictional issues around that? That has to be addressed by the company, by the criminal justice system, and then providing advocacy and support services to those people. But also diversity, equity, and inclusion is super important in recognizing intersectionality, and how this movement for so long has not done an adequate job addressing gender-based violence in every community, and ensuring that every community is taking leadership roles, is that we're not freezing people out, that we're recognizing that trauma affects people in different ways. So that is very important, because trauma and interventions and prevention look different in different communities, and so does prevalence of sexual assault and domestic violence. And also, I would say training, and then how people can access services is looking different. I'm really proud to be a part of a program at End Violence Against Women International called Seek Then Speak, which is, if you go to seekthenspeak.app, it's not an app, it is actually a computer program, which actually makes it much easier to access. In the Seek component, you can go online and just completely anonymously review all of your options. If you're a survivor or a support person, you can look at, and this is for sexual assault, what does it look like if you need medical care? What does it look like if you want to report to law enforcement? You can ask questions like, can you take a support person with you? Is it going to cost you anything? And then while you're there, if you decide you wanted to start reporting to law enforcement, you can start doing that online. And you click on Speak, and it will take you through a trauma-informed sexual assault investigative interview. And so in your own home or wherever you're comfortable, you can read through, what would it look like if I did report this to the police? And you can fill out as much information as you want. It explains why they would be asking these kinds of questions when you're done. And also it uses technology, and so you can enter the information in whatever language you choose that you are most comfortable with, and it will translate the questions for you. And then you can either send it to law enforcement if you want to. You can take it to your local rape crisis center and they can submit it for you. anonymously if that's what you choose, or you can download it and keep it in case you decide that you do want to report it sometime in the future. And so that is one thing that we're excited about. Communities around the United States are using that, and they're finding, in Kansas City, for instance, the law enforcement loves this tool because they find that survivors come and they have really thought it through. They have so much more detailed information to report, and they feel so much more confident in the system because they are prepared. They know what kind of questions are going to be asked. That is one piece of technology that is really promising.
Amazing. So I just put the correct link there. Can you just talk a little bit from a generation perspective, and then some questions come in, like what was the origin of the idea, and then how did you or the team or whoever you contracted make sure that what was being developed, was going to fit the needs of people being affected by a sexual, like, so there's the idea, but how did you get from the idea to actually doing it?
Great question. And it can't just be what I think is a great question or a great process. You have to find out what survivors need, what law enforcement needs if they're going to be accepting these reports, what kind of advocacy support can be available to survivors afterwards. So this was a project that started probably 10 years ago. And there was an initial phase of it. There were focus groups. It was a really promising endeavor. And then the technology company that we were working with essentially folded. And so we had to go back to the drawing board, and we had to sit down and really research what survivors most needed, what was going to be the simplest technologically that accomplished the task. And so we started working with a technology company. We had pilot sites. We got feedback from advocates. We got feedback from survivors. We got feedback from law enforcement, and incorporated it. And the first version we created was not the final product. We created a version. We put it out there. People said, these things work and these things do not. So we went back and got additional foundation funding to improve the technology, to tweak it, and then put it back out there. And now it's much more useful to survivors. And so I would say probably your first version of whatever you're doing is not going to be your best version, and continue to seek input, especially from the people who are using whatever you're doing, who are affected by what you're doing. Incorporate that and make it better.
Amazing advice. So wonderful. And tech is not the solution. It can be a tool. So a couple more questions have come in. So I want to get to those. So Amelia, she's based in Washington, D.C. From a younger professional, it seems like a lot of the international gender-based violence related work is for short-term consultancies. Do you see this trend continuing? And what is your advice for younger professionals who want the experience, but don't, either don't have the experience or are, need some more stability than just kind of occasional consultancies?
Good question, Amelia. So I don't know the answer to the question about how much short-term consultancies is going to continue. What I would say is, again, if you don't have experience in gender-based violence, that real hands-on experience, find your local rape crisis center. There are a couple of great rape crisis centers and excellent domestic violence centers, and people doing fantastic work on human trafficking at the local level in the DC area. The DC Rape Crisis Center is great, for instance. And so get that hands-on experience, but also find a mentor. Reach out to Vital Voices. Reach out to you're in a great area for this, to those organizations where you would want to work. Find somebody to connect to, do informational interviews with them about what it would take to get a position at that organization. What are the skills that they're looking for? And are they the skills that you already have? In which case, how do you communicate those skills to the places where you want to work in a full-time position? And if those are not skills you have now, make a plan for how you're going to acquire those skills.
Okay. Wonderful. So the next question, I forgot this person's name, apologies. They're asking specifically for Ghana, but let's broaden it out. So how can volunteer organizations in whatever country or community help to make sure their combating gender-based violence for their volunteers or their host communities. So I would broaden this out. So in Colombia, where I live, there's a lot of trafficking, a lot of prostitution, child prostitution. And so, if you're thinking, there's a whole field of safeguarding and international development. So any thoughts on that? But also I can say in Colombia, it happens, people are arrested, there's crimes, but also increasingly I'm seeing, like Kathleen and I went somewhere recently, in a lot of tourist places now will say, if we see any evidence of child trafficking or abuse, it's almost like they've been trained at some of them, not all of them, but they're aware it's happening. And I think they're getting informed by police and tourist authorities, like, hey, if there's something suspicious going on, you have a responsibility to report it. And they're actually putting these signs in more and more places where, let's say, foreigners more frequently, not everywhere foreigners go, but places where this is more likely to happen. So any thoughts, if someone is either, and there's a lot of controversy around volunteerism in general,
right.
But like any thoughts on safeguarding in general, or safeguarding in volunteer projects?
That is a great question. I'll say right now that is not my area of expertise, but there are a lot of organizations who are working on this. I know, for instance, the Peace Corps. A lot of Peace Corps volunteers reported that they were being sexually assaulted or hurt, and the Peace Corps had to do something about it. And then they hadn't adequately solved the problem or figured it out, and so there were more repercussions, and the Peace Corps really had to go back and rethink how to keep their volunteers safe. And my organization, End Violence Against Women International, has been a part of that and has done training for the Peace Corps, not for volunteers on how to keep yourself safe, but how the Peace Corps as an entity can help make sure that the resources are available for survivors, and that they're, as an organization, thinking about how to keep their volunteers safe. And so I would say, reach out to those organizations that are doing it well, and figure out how you can incorporate those models.
Okay. I commented Elsa Marie da Silva from India, is a Vital Voices Fellow and BMW Fellow, Foundation Fellow, and she was on our podcast first season, also a Rotary Peace Fellow. We met in Switzerland many years ago, but her organization, she's one of the leading practitioners and advocates around reducing gender-based violence, and they've been using technology called Safe City. So, so it sounds like EVA, Ending Violence Against Women International, is doing this great kind of process in the US, and yes, they're in India and a couple other countries, and it's more, and they do a lot of training, capacity building, but it's also reporting sexual harassment on the street, almost like crowd mapping, crowdsourcing. So for people, you can take a look, listen to the podcast or check it out. Then you got a personal comment. Isabel from Colombia said she's going to be in Miami, so hopefully you two can connect. We have a few
That's
more.
Amazing.
We have a few more minutes for questions or comments, so I'll ask a few things, but I'd love to hear from a few other people. So one question we've already talked about some is when you're not working, family and hobbies and all that stuff. Are you currently working on upskilling related to anything that you feel you want to be stronger in? And if you are, not that you have to be, and if you are, is it books, LinkedIn, a course, or anything you're kind of working to develop or want to develop more skills in?
I am. There are so many areas that I want to gain even more skills in, and that is something, for any job seeker, be somebody and communicate that you're somebody who's always wanting to learn new things and gain new skills, because things are always changing. Whatever you know now and you're great at now is going to be different in 2 years, and what those expectations of your role will be. Fundraising is an area that I really have been working on getting better at. Fundraising is just so critical to the work that all of us do, is communicating your message, finding the people who want to be involved, offering them an opportunity to get involved in your work by donating, that, and then figuring out the messaging, the platform. It's something you could study for 50 years and never get perfect at. And there's so many different areas. There's looking at, there's so much technology now in fundraising and figuring out what kind of technology is actually going to be useful for your organization and what technology would just not be worth the money. So I would say that's an area that I am very interested in.
Thank you. And thank you, Joseph, for sharing your name again. So a related question, we actually get this a lot in PCDN community, and I'm okay at fundraising. Like I've done it, both grants and contracts, individual donations. It's not my strength, and I'm not a superior at it. But we get asked this a lot, like what are if someone doesn't know that much about fundraising and they want to develop skills, any particular books, communities, or trainings you would recommend? Because this comes in almost every week, that people either need to do it for their organization or they want to do it to be, to advance their career, or both.
Okay, there's some fundraisers that I follow, and so Rachel Meir is the League of Extraordinary Fundraisers. I'm a part of her group, and every week we meet and for about 75 minutes to talk about, we review the fundraising appeals that we're writing. So anyway, you can get so far into it that you're meeting once a week with people. But what I did is you can just Google it, and there are some amazing people. There's Tom Ahern, there's Jeff Brooks, there is Julie Cooper, and so many of them offer free information, and there are free webinars on how to start fundraising. And I would say what you need to do is really think about your message. Why should people care about you? Not just why your organization is great at what you do, but really think about the impact that you're communicating. If I talk about how many law enforcement officers we trained that last year to provide better investigations for sexual assault survivors, that's impressive. But when you talk about the difference it made in somebody's life, and you can share the story of Chelsea, who reported to her campus law enforcement and nobody believed her, and she had terrible treatment from the medical professionals at the hospital. And then she came across a prosecutor who had been to a Start by Believing training, and he called her up when she felt like all hope was lost, and he said, "Chelsea, your case just came across my desk. I believe you, and I am going to stand with you, and I'm going to fight with you." And that changed everything in her life. And so that's the kind of thing, is communicate kind of impact people are going to be able to make in the lives of the people that you're serving.
Amazing. Do you have any, because there's the individual examples and there's the cumulative impact. So any tips from your current work or previous work? How do you, when you think about the end of the year, both for your donors and your board and your community, what are some key metrics you all like to share? I mean, there's the stories, which are incredible, but how do you go beyond that? And what else are you sharing as an organization, or in your previous work? Like, how do you aggregate that to a higher level of impact?
That's really interesting, Craig, because research shows that when you tell people, if you have a document saying that we served 400,000 refugees last year, and we provided medical care to 200,000 people, that turns people off. The donor can't relate to that. It might be more effective for a foundation or a government grant that you're trying to get. But when you're talking with individual donors, you can say, here is the story of one refugee that we served, and this is the impact that they had. And so you can imagine that your $50, that your $100, that your $2,000 can make a difference in this person's life. It's harder to imagine you're making a difference for 200,000 people. And so always bringing it down to the one person, a story that is representative of the work that you're accomplishing, is the most effective.
I hope you offer a fundraising class soon.
Thank you.
in your spare time. So I have we got a few more people. So we have a few minutes left for questions. Welcome, Paliva. I'm not sure if you're based in India or the US, but please feel free to share a little bit more about your work. And I'll end with two questions, and we have time for one or two more if they come in. So one is, we always ask this question, not connected to your work. Any show or movie or book you're reading, this has nothing to do with like anything with social change, that just has like kind of helped you think or it could just be pure for enjoyment, like anything that, like I love the Apple show Severance on Apple TV. If anyone hasn't seen it, I think it's one of the most brilliant shows about work and life and the future. Ben Stiller is the director, and waiting for season 2. But any show that just kind of has, or a book or something like that.
So a book that I love that I've read recently is called Stolen Focus by Johan Hari.
Yeah.
And he talks about how we're all having a difficult time focusing and thinking deeply, and how that is very, very purposely, that lack of focus is driven by social media companies wanting us to spend more and more of our time looking at our phones, scrolling through social media, all those things. So I highly recommend reading that. And also I'm watching The Summer I Turned Pretty with my 15-year-old daughter, because it's something we do in the evenings, and it's not a great show, but it's a lot of fun to spend time with my daughter.
Yes. No, we have a 12-year-old, and we spend most of our time going to soccer. But we all love Only Murders in the Building.
We watched that
the series. Like, I mean, it's on, I don't know what channel. I think Hulu, but it's Steve Martin and Martin Short. Yeah, Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez, and it's fun and not too violent.
Yeah, I will say a quality show that I also watch is Reservation Dogs.
Oh yeah, I've been watching that. I finished season 1, and Reservation Dogs, I think it's on FX or what channel? I don't know what channel in the US.
I watch it on Hulu.
Yeah, so it's about a Native American community, and it's scripted and acted, and I think directed by Native Americans, and it's really, it's fun, it's absurd, and I think it's powerful to watch. So I'm only through season 1. So just 2 more things, and then, so in terms of people staying engaged about your work, I mean, obviously LinkedIn, any other channels that obviously people can follow Ending Violence Against Women International, but for following both the organization and your work, LinkedIn, is that the best place? Or you
follow me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing, because, it takes all of us to address gender-based violence. And so many people around the world are doing amazing work. And I would love to learn from you and share any resources or tips that I have, whether it's about fundraising or project management, or helping with improve the healthcare sector, or improving law enforcement response. But also End Violence Against Women International, we have a tremendous amount of free resources on our website for training. Law enforcement agencies all over the country and around the world use our training for their sex crimes detectives. We also have a free resource library. We have about 17,000 documents downloaded every single day by people. And so I highly recommend you go to our website for more information.
Yeah, and the newsletter. And then just the last question for people who are...
Oh yes, and sign up for our newsletter.
Yes. And then for people who, like, where do you go to find your community of practice? You have different roles in your job. So part of it's technical, part of it's fundraising, part of it's communications. But where do you go? Like, is there a conference, an online event, a website, a newsletter? Like, where do you go where you find either the best quality information, or like the one event a year that this is where people attend? So any places you would say for others working on preventing or mitigating gender-based violence or sexual assault, like these are your top 2 or 3, is it a podcast, a newsletter? Where do you go?
Yes. So you have me thinking about conferences and information. SVRI, which is the Sexual Violence Resource Institute, I believe. They're based in South Africa. They are absolutely amazing. They do top quality research. They also connect communities around the world. They have news from around the world. They have podcasts. They have conferences. They have trainings. They have job positions. I would say that is a tremendous resource. And also in terms of conferences, the National Sexual Assault Conference in the US is great for advocacy and really looking at what is coming next and how we can best prevent and address gender-based violence. And also our conference, I've got to say, when I was working in the field in Florida, I would say the End Violence Against Women International Conference every year. We have about 100 people from Ghana come every year, and people from around the world come. And that is the best conference when you are working in any way in the criminal justice response to sexual assault and domestic violence, gender-based violence.
Can you just say a sentence or two about the conference, when it tends to be, and is it more civil society, or it's more practitioners, or it's more policing, or who policymakers, who tends to go?
So the End Violence Against Women International Conference, it's usually the top two professions going are law enforcement, and criminal, like prosecutors, also maybe investigators in the military, and advocates. And we also have healthcare providers. We have people working in substance abuse. We have faith leaders attending. The next one is April 1st through the 3rd in San Francisco. No, I'm sorry, San Diego in 2013. 2024.
we're going back.
All of the dates wrong. April 1st through the 3rd, 2024 in San Diego.
And you get a decent attendance, so it's not just people from North America. There's practitioners and others.
Absolutely. We had almost 2,500 people attend the last one. That was in Chicago this year. And we have hundreds of people from around the world. We have people from every state, every U.S. territory, protectorate.
Okay. So a lot of people ask for links. So just, please, this podcast will be up probably by next Friday. So we'll put some links in there, but also PCDN, Ending Violence Against Women International, the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, Safe City from India. So, looking at this, you should be able to find some good podcasts. Some good resources and podcasts, and feel free to put in the comments other resources, and we can add them to the post that goes along with the podcast. That'll be up next week. And before we end, any other words of wisdom, or, just for people working on the long, hard slog of change? And the wonders, but like, any other thoughts?
My thoughts are thank you. Thank you, every person who is listening to this podcast right now and in here with us, for the work that you do in every sector, because you are making a difference in your communities, and you are making a global difference. And without you, this work we couldn't get it done.
Okay. So thank you. So we're going to end here. Again, the two asks is follow Grace, follow PCDN. And, we have 100 and about 15 other episodes, amazing people from 30 different countries, running NGOs, doing impact investing, reducing gender-based violence, and from all different sectors. So please listen, share, and especially rate, and stay tuned. This is season 11, lots of great guests coming up. And thank you so much, Grace. And Cricket in the background is starting to get a little bit moving. And everyone for listening from around the world. And again, please follow Ending Violence Against Women International, share their resources. I didn't realize your conference was that big, so amazing. And have a wonderful day, no matter where you are in the world.
Bye, everyone.
I'm hitting end stream.